working with JSON, we have to look at an actual JSON file. So I have created this JSON file, and we can see that it does follow the same core structures as a JavaScript object. Remembering this is JavaScript object notation, JSON. So we use curly braces to define this object, and then we have properties and values. Key points to remember: properties always are going to be in double quotation marks, followed by a colon, and then the value is going to be in double quotes as well, unless that value is a number. If it's a number, it does not require it to be inside of quotes. Each property value or key value is then followed by a comma. So we have group name, Fellowship of the Ring, location, Middle Earth, purpose, destroy the ring, enemy, Sauron, members, colon, and now you'll notice a square brace instead of a curly brace. So the square brace or square bracket defines that this next grouping of objects is going to be an array. So we have the square brace here continuing down to the end where we have the final square brace, final curly brace representing the mate or pair to the opening curly brace. So with that, I have now defined out the characters, and now this is a repeating group of elements where we have name, character type, and weapon. So we have the first character followed by a comma, second comma, third. So this is the course kind of structure that we would see commonly in in a JSON file. Remembering properties or keys as well as values always are in double quotes, separated by a colon for the key value relationship, and then commas after all of those. You'll also notice that I am not cuddling my quote or my braces or brackets. So writing JSON, it's easier to read it when it does not have cuddling involved. So we put our opening and closing braces on separate lines. So I open and close, so then we can just see the key value pairs inside that set of curly braces. It's easier to read the JSON when it's formatted without cuddling. So that would be a time where I would choose not to do that, though in most cases, if you've noticed, I choose to cuddle my braces because I find that in normal JavaScript it's easier to read, but in JSON it works better for me not to have that. Now after you have some JSON, especially if you write it yourself, one of the things that you may wish to do is to check the JSON to make sure that the JSON is correctly written and formatted so that it has no errors in it. So then when you try and work with that data, it doesn't cause problems. One thing that we can find online are JSON formatters and validators. So they help to validate our JSON. And sometimes we want to use a formatter because we will get JSON data and there are no line breaks, no indents or spaces. It's all just one continuous batch of characters, very hard to read. And if we use the formatter, it will reformat it for us so that we can read the JSON. It makes it human readable. So I've copied the JSON that I have written and I'm going to paste it in here, and then I'm going to process it. And when I do that, it tells me, hey, look, that JSON's valid. Great. But if my JSON, say, was missing, say I missed a comma, and now I process it, it comes up and tells me, oh, this is invalid, and it's telling me on line 131 that there is a mistake. So I would have to go find 131, which if I look in my code, well, okay, apparently the 131 doesn't correspond to my line breaks, but so it said it's expecting a comma. Oh, and we click on that and it brings it to us and goes, hey, look, you are missing a comma right there. So we can see that's right after Pippin. So go back to the top, go here, put in a comma, process, and now it's valid once more. So using a JSON formatter and validator is a great way to confirm that any JSON that you write is usable. So here I have gathered some data from OpenWeatherMap, and we can see that this is really not very usable and is very hard to read. But if I select it and copy it, if we go back over to our JSON validator, let's process it. And now what we will see is we can see how that data has been organized into a structure, making it go from this, which is not very readable, to this, where I can start to see how the data has been formatted. So I can use that as I'm trying to understand the JSON that comes back from an API service and make sense out of what I would be looking for on it. So then when I'm trying to access this, so if I create and put all of this data into a JavaScript object, I could then access it by grabbing my weather object .list .main .temp, and then it can give me that value. But we're also going to see that we have these elements that are part of in the list. We'd have to say which element in that list, because each one of these is now a day and time and weather data entry. So we'll have to use square bracket notation as well. So we'll be taking a look at how we can do that in a little bit. So using a formatter allows us to understand it, because that is not fun to read. This, while it may not be fun, is now doable. So we use the validator and the formatter as ways to do that. And this is just one. A quick Google search is going to find you any number of formatters and validators for JSON, so you can find other ones and decide if they're easier for you to read, if they work better, if you like how they work. This was just one that I have used before. Now that we have a basic understanding of a JSON document, it's time to implement that in our file. So looking at this file, we can see that it's got basic structure, loads of font, does a little bit of CSS stuff for the elements that are coming later. I have a header section and then a section. So a header element and a section element in my markup, and I have the script down at the bottom. So that is what we are going to look at next. So what we are going to do is we are going to load the JSON, and once we've loaded the JSON, then we are going to be able to add to this JSON or to the markup using the JSON to populate the content. So the first thing that I want to do is grab a reference to my header section. So I use a query selector. And grab it, and then we'll also grab the section. So that now gives us a reference to those, so we can do something with them in a little bit. Now comes the fun part. This is where we are going to load the JSON. So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to create a variable object that is going to then use curly braces here, that is going to store a reference to the contents of the JSON. So I am storing that reference here. Now it's possible that we could get away without doing this, that we could do everything in some of the lines that are coming and not have an actual variable reference to that object. But in the interest of maintaining consistency of how we've worked on previous projects and transparency in the code to make it a little bit easier, we're going to use this structure with it. The next thing that I want to do is create a variable. I'm going to title it HXR, and this is going to be a new an XML HTTP. All right, I was hoping code completion would help me there. So it's an XML HTTP request. And HXR, you'll notice those are the capital letters. That's the short version that I use for my variable name. So this XML HTTP request is where we are going to make a request to load in a data file. Now to do that, what we have to do is we have to tell this request, we'll use a method that's part of it. So XML HTTP request is a method that is baked into JavaScript. So it has then methods that we can access, of which one is open. And now with that, we are going to tell it what we want to do. In this case, I want to get information, and then I specify where I want to get that information from. Notice right now I'm writing JavaScript, not JSON, so I can get away with using single quotes. JavaScript generally does not care if I use single quotes or double quotes. JSON requires double quotes throughout. So I'm going to access my fellowship JSON file. Now what we need to then do is we need to tell it what is the format of our data that we are going to receive. And in this case, it is going to be text. So the response type, and there are different options that we can choose there, but in this case, we want to choose text as our option for it. So we've now created an open command, but that open command is not going to run until we specify we need to send that message. When we put HXR send, that is when we then make the request of the server, in this case, the file that we're loading. When we move into using the open weather map and play with that, we're going to be making a request where we will then specify an API call. So instead of just a file name, we have this full URL that we're working with, HTTP, then API open weather map org, blah, 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 API key, etc. So that is what would then go into the statement of what are we trying to get? Where is that data coming from? So our open command says I'm getting data, and this is where I am going to get that data from. But we don't want to just call HXR send yet. And if we did it this way with, say, open weather map, we would generate an error because we would be sending out and trying to access it before we know that the contents from the server have been loaded. Because this file is in the same folder and directory as the HTML file, and the JavaScript that's asking for it, the response would be close enough time-wise that it would probably work without spitting out any problems. So we've established an XML HTTP request. We've said it's going to be a GET request. We've specified the file. We're going to open, and then the response type of what we receive back from that request will be text. Now I want to have my HXR request to listen for the event of load, meaning it has now loaded the contents from the server, whether it's a file or an API call. And then, well, extra character there. Then we're going to call a function, and the function, oh, we lost our closing paren there as part of it. So add event listener load, we are going to call this anonymous function. Now inside this anonymous function, what we want to do is say if the status of our HXR request. So when we make a request, it's going to provide us a code. The code number is the status of the request. A successful request has a status code of 200. So that's what we're hoping we get back. And if we don't get back 200, then we're going to log out that message and I will say my HXR will log out what that number is so that if we do run into a problem, we will get an error code. And if we get that error code, we will see it in our console, and then we can look up what is the meaning of that code and try and troubleshoot what went wrong. So the first thing I'm going to do is just log out a message and say success with this. So if we look here, again, we've created a new request. It's going to be get. It's going to ask for that file. It's going to send us text. And then when that file has loaded, we're going to check our status. If it's 200, meaning it was a successful request, tells us success. Otherwise, it's going to give us the status of our failed request. So I can save it. And looking at my page, I will see that it logged out success. Ignore these other things. I'm just getting some weird things showing up in my console when I'm running the live server. We don't have to worry about those. So the success worked. So now if we go back here, if I change something, so if we ask for a file that's not there, we'll see our error that it gave us. It doesn't say success because line 56 is my log statement, but instead the message it says is 404, meaning document not found. And we can see it says 404 not found. But if you've worked on web things long enough, you know that 404 is a not found statement. So we're off to a good success. We're seeing something happen here with it. Now, what we could try and do, if we want to work with it, no, before we do that, what I can do is now say fellowship, so that variable that we set earlier, we're going to set it equal to json.parse, lowercase p. And what we want to do is we want to parse the HXR response, not type, but text. So the response text, and I spelled response wrong, let me add that final E. The response text is the actual content that just came back from the server. Now, if I put JSON parse, what that does is it transforms that text. It converts it into a JavaScript object. Otherwise, I would just be getting back text, because if you remember, the response type we looked for was text. This now parses that or converts that text into a bona fide, fully featured JavaScript object so that we can work with it. Now, if I were to log out fellowship, save this and see what we get. If I look over here, I will see, okay, it's looking kind of like that file we had, where we can see, okay, I have my group name, location, purpose, enemy. I can go through and find, notice, see, this is an array. It tells me there are 9 members in this array. And I can see their different properties, or I can open up each one. So these are the members of the array that are part of my fellowship JSON. So it's working. We're off to a really good start right now. The next thing that we want to do is to be able to populate our HTML with the contents of this JSON. So to do that, I am going to create a function I'll call it populate content. And now with this, I'm going to create an H1, set that equal to document create element, and specify the kind of element that I'm creating. With that element created, we will set the text content equal to our JSON object fellowship, and the property we will look for is the group name. So now I have access to the group name, and then finally we will append this H1 to the header element of the HTML page. So when I save my document, I go over here. But before we jump over to our document, I forgot, we probably should. We're going to not log that out because we know that's working, so we'll just comment that. What I need to do is call my populate content function. Now when I do that, we will see it puts the H1 there at the top of the page. And if I look at my elements, I will see in the header, there's that H1. But if I look at my markup, I'll see that there is nothing there. It got added when we created the element and appended it to the document. Now, what I want to do is to create an H2. And this will be my H2. And this H2 text content will be equal to, and this time I am going to combine some additional text along with what is in the JSON file. So I'm going to do a string literal. So I use the tick marks under the escape key, not the single quotes. So these are the slanted tick marks. Very important that we use the correct one. So I will put inhabitants of, and then to access variable element, $ curly brace, and then I will specify the property in the JSON. So each one of these things, fellowship is the object, and then I'm grabbing the property name, and then when I do that, it displays the property value. So we still have one more thing to make this work. So we have to append it to our document. Now if I look over here, we can see that it is indeed successful that we have appended that onto it. The next item I want to do will be an H3. And then we will set our text content for this item equal to, and once again we'll use tick marks so we can do a string literal. I want a capital there. And now I'm going to access a location. Sorry, not location, purpose here. So the purpose of the fellowship, whose purpose was to destroy the ring and vanquish the almighty overlord of Sauron. So we've now created our third line here. Now if we save that out, and I typed H2 instead of H3 again, so that didn't quite work. Let's try again. Its purpose was to destroy the ring and vanquish Sauron. Oh, I probably should put a period at the end of that, so I will go into that string literal and put in a final period. It just looks better with the period. All right, so we're off to a good start. Now comes the fun part. Now we get to start displaying the heroes. So what I'm going to do is create a variable, and I'll call it heroes, and this will be fellowship, and we're going to access the array of members. So we store a reference to that array. So notice those are square brackets, not curly braces. So anytime we're using arrays, we always use square brackets. When we are doing everything else, it's generally going to be with the curly braces. The next thing I want to do is a for loop to cycle over, because I don't want to have to write out hero 1, hero 2, hero 3 9 times. That would really suck. But if I use a for loop, we can cycle through it the number of times there are heroes. So we can ask for what is the length of that array of heroes. So we're going to cycle through this array, and remembering that when we access array, and I'm going to uncomment this again just for a moment, save it, and now if we, oh, let's see, 81, we have, oh, it's unhappy because I never finished out this for statement here. So now let's save it. So if I look at the heroes once more, go here, there are my 9 members in that array. Notice they're at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, if I look at my for loop, I is going to start at 0, go through the number of heroes, which is 9, as long as we're less than hero's length. So 0 through 8 will allow us to access each hero in our document. Now we have a header, we have sections, we're going to put a bunch of articles. We'll use an article to hold a reference to each one of our heroes. So I will make a reference to that. So now I make my reference to that article. I'm going to make a reference to a headline to store the hero's name. We'll put it in an H3. And then I'm going to make a reference to a paragraph, and the paragraph is where I'm going to be able to talk about what type of character and what weapon they use. So it will be a document. So we've now created 3 elements here. So now our H3 text content is going to be equal to the hero. So we say heroes and then use square brackets to access the array. So when we use I, because we're looping through this for loop using I as a reference to where we are, and then we will grab that name property that is part of that hero. Not names, just name. And now we can tell the article to append child page 3, and then I can tell my section to append child my article. So currently we've only put in the name. We're just doing this first just to see how it works, to make sure it's working, and I can see now I've put the names into my document. So I've had generated access to those. So now that we know that works, let's grab our text content for our purpose. Again, tick marks, string literal. All of our heroes that are referenced here are male, so I'm going to stick with that for now. So he was a, and then I'm going to, $, curly brace, and then I'll say heroes, square bracket I, close square bracket, and then I will reference the property of character type, closing curly, space, who fought with a, and this is going to work somewhat well unless someone uses a weapon that would require an instead of a, but we're going to live with it for today because then we can move forward and not have to worry about checking to find out if the letter is a vowel, and if so, then we would have to use an instead of a, so we're not going to worry about that just yet, but you certainly could write that in and do a check for it. So heroes I, and the property we are looking for is weapon. Close out the curly brace, put in a period. Now what we need to do is tell the article to append child, and this we appended the H3, and we'll append the paragraph of it. Save it out. Look. So now we have our characters. He was a wizard who fought with a staff. He was a dwarf who fought with an axe. Yeah, see, that's our problem there. So if he doesn't use an axe, if it was a hammer, then it would be fine. Otherwise, the rest work out okay. Sam fought with his pan. Merry and Pippin, they fought with a variety of things. But their swords that they used were knives for full-size individuals. But this allows us to see, by using our HXR, we can get the contents of a file, whether it's on a server or local. We can then verify it's loaded, and if it successfully loads, we parse it into a JSON object. So we take the text we received, parsing it into JSON, and then we can do something with that content. In this case, I am writing to the HTML on my page.